How 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 does agriculture actually? I mean, you call it biotic cleansing. I mean, how does that actually work? How does it actually, first off, commit the biotic cleansing, and second off, how does it destroy the soil? What happens? I mean, you.
Okay, great. Good question. So, I want all the listeners to think about what's outside their bedroom window or their back door or even their front door. Probably it's a little piece of land, 10 feet by 10 feet, depending. Maybe you live in the country. But if you live anywhere, urban or suburban, you're going to see a tiny little patch of land, and it's mostly going to be grass, probably Kentucky bluegrass or something like that, that was put there as a decoration. Now, if you want to grow a garden, what do you have to do? Well, you have to dig up that grass. You can't just throw lettuce seeds on top of it and hope for the best. I mean, I can tell you what will happen, and it's exactly nothing. There is no way that the annual seeds of those domesticated vegetables are ever going to outcompete that grass. Grass is fabulous stuff. It does not die. I mean, it's pretty much, invincible. And so to remove it, you have to apply a whole bunch of labor. You're going to have to dig and dig and dig and get rid of it. Then, with the soil bared, you can plant whatever annual crop you were thinking of planting. So to have a garden, it would be lettuce or tomatoes or squash or whatever. But those are annual crops, right? They only come once. They're not going to be here again next year. That's what an annual means. It's they only grow for like annum 1 year, and that's in contrast to perennials, which grow many years. So trees are perennials. Clearly, they can grow 2,000 years out here in the redwoods. Grasses are perennials. Well, there are annual grasses, but most grasses are perennials. And then there's lots of things in between that are also perennials, like shrubs and vines and whatnot. But then there's another category of plants that are annuals, and they only grow for 1 year, or maybe even 2 or 3 seasons, and then they're done. And these two different categories of plants, they have a very different function in nature. The perennials are really like, the perennials, everything of terrestrial life depends on those perennials in place. They do a couple of really basic things. One is which, because they live a long time, they have the actual time. They have the capacity to have a really deep root system. So their roots go down really, really, really far because they have many years to get there. And once they're there, they can actually break up rock, so the substrata that our planet is made from. And by breaking up that rock, they make the minerals available to every other living creature on the planet. They are the ones that recirculate those minerals and keep them coming up to the surface so that other plants and soil creatures and ultimately animals can eat them. I mean, without those minerals, we're all dead.
Like iron.
The plants do that for us. What's that?
Like iron.
Yeah, like iron, like anything, like
calcium.
zinc, like, manganese, you name it. Selenium. It's the plants that do that. And they are the only ones that can do that. Annuals do not have deep root systems. And this is really important for people to understand. They don't live long enough to develop root systems. It's not part of their genetic code to make deep root systems. They have one purpose, and that's to create a giant seed head. That's what annuals do. They have a really short period of time. They're only going to live that 2 or 3 seasons. And everything is about the continuation of the species. And their one shot at a future is to have a great big seed head, is to produce that baby and wrap it in as much nutrients and then as many defenses as it can, and that gives you a great big seed. And that's why annual seeds tend to be way bigger than perennial seeds, is because it's got to last. It's got to make sure that plant baby survives when the time comes. So not only do those perennial plants break up the rock and do the mineral thing, but also those really deep root systems are what let the water table recharge, because every little tiny filament of root helps water. Every time it rains, the water can now enter the soil down through that channel of the root system. And then when the community needs that water again later in the summer, say when it's dry, it's like a great big sponge, and those perennial plants can pull on that water as they need it and keep the whole community alive. So that's what perennials do. And I guess the third really important thing is they keep the soil covered at all times. So if you think about a forest or you think about a prairie, you do not see bare soil. You'll see duff in a forest, which is decaying plant matter, and of course in a real prairie, you're not going to see really any bare soil. You're just going to see plants. Just for as far as the eye can see, it'll just be perennial grasses. And that's really important because without being protected, the soil, it's just like the rest of us, it dies when it's exposed. So the sun bakes it, and the wind blows it away, and the rain compacts it, and you just end up with dust, essentially, instead of living matter. So that's what perennials do. Now, there's a role for annuals in nature, which is, another way of saying that nature loves an opportunist, and there are opportunities in nature for these annual plants. So if there's an emergency situation, some kind of a disaster like a fire or a flood or an earthquake, when a landslide, when the ground might be bared for some reason, well, that's an emergency in nature, because that's the basis of life now being degraded. So immediately the annuals spring to life. It's because the perennials have been cleared away by this disaster, right? So there's a fire or a flood. Now you can picture, the bank of a river has been wiped dry by, wiped clean by a flood. It's just mud. And the first thing that happens is all those annual seeds, those great big baby seeds, they've been waiting in the soil for their moment. There's no competition now from the perennials and the perennial root systems. Now they can spring to life, and they do. So they will cover that bare soil for a year or two. It's like if you cut yourself, your skin, your hand, your arm, you would put a Band-Aid on it, and that's what the annuals do. They provide that Band-Aid. Now, eventually, your skin's going to knit back together, and that's the perennial grasses or the forest trees coming back in, and they knit that back together in the same way, and then you don't need the Band-Aid anymore. So in the same way, the annuals, you won't see them anymore in the landscape, and their seeds, again, lie buried until they're needed for an emergency. So it's not like annuals are bad and perennials are good. It's just that most of the plant matter, the cellulose matter on the planet is going to be perennials. But the annuals have their moment, and it's when those emergencies happen. So the problem with agriculture is it's that emergency over and over and over. In order to plant those giant seed heads, in order for them to have a chance, you've got to clear the land. So you have to remove the grasses or pull down the forest, right? And then you can plant those seeds. So corn or wheat or whatever it's going to be, that's the only way that you can do it. You cannot simply sprinkle them in the grass and hope for the best, or sprinkle them in a forest. Nothing will happen. We all know this as gardeners. So just extend that across the planet. That's where all of those annual monocrops, that's where they come from, is by destroying the grasslands of the world, and ultimately pulling down a lot of the forests as well. And these are the demands of agriculture. So you can't just do it once. It has to be done over and over. It is a war against the living world, because the world doesn't want to be a monocrop. This is a living planet, and it wants to stay alive, and that means protecting that topsoil. It also means that all of those plants and animals really want their homes. So you're going to be fighting a war against all those plants and animals that want to come back. So all the perennial grasses, all the trees. Anybody who's gardened knows that you're forever fighting the grasses that want to be there. And if you let it go for a few years, what will eventually come back, of course, is the secession of either the forest or the prairie. And which, in one way, is, really that's ultimately the hope, is that if we just get out of the way, this planet will repair. That drive that life wants to live is, it's such a profound impulse in every living creature that they would take their homes back if we simply stopped fighting that war. But that's what agriculture is. And a lot of people don't understand this, and I think it's because we've been living in an agricultural society for really 10,000 years now. Ultimately this started way back, ancient Mesopotamia and the Fertile Crescent and all of that, but it's a direct line. Eventually it conquers Europe, and then, the Europeans bring it to the North and South America, and they do a bunch of conquering as well, and, eventually this is what you end up with, is the whole world has just been covered with these annual monocrops, as much of it as could be. And we've reached the end. By 1950, the world was out of topsoil, and since that point, we've actually been eating fossil fuel instead of soil, because the soil's gone. We've skinned the planet alive. So fossil fuel took over instead, which certainly brings with it a whole other set of horrors, which are frankly worse. So, have I answered your question? I feel like I'm just rambling.
Well, no, that's so great. And I have